Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Melcher, the founder of the Future of Storytelling Summit, and we're delighted to have you here with us today for the weekly roundtable conversation. Our guest today is Frank Rose. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Charlie.
Glad you could be here with us. Frank is a brilliant writer, former contributing writer to Wired magazine, and the author of the best-selling book, The Art of Immersion. And here we've got a shameless plug. And it's a shameless plug, I must say, because this was really one of my favorite books and had a tremendous impact on my thinking for the Future of Storytelling Summit. So it's a great honor to have you with us here today, Frank. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Really pleased to be here.
We also have a very illustrious panel with us today. Ian, why don't you say hello and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ian Forrester, and I work for BBC RAD, and I'm working on a technology called Perceptive Media, which hopefully fits perfectly with the future of storytelling.
Thank you. Glad to have you with us, Ian.
Thank you.
Hello, Matt.
Hi there, I'm Matt Locke. I'm the director of Storythings, a company in the UK that helps people tell stories in an age of digital attention. Before that, I spent over a decade working on cross-platform projects at Channel 4 and the BBC.
Welcome. Glad you're here with us. Thanks, Matt. Hello, Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Bonds, and I'm the head of 42 Entertainment, and we tell interactive stories and immersive entertainment, and we've been doing it for about 10 years. And before that, I was an Imagineer, and we actually built immersive environments to take people on real immersive experiences, so it's a good transition to the digital age.
Well, this is a great group of people to immerse ourselves with in the art of immersion. So Frank, I thought I'd ask you to start us off today by just telling us a little bit about the book, its premise, and what got you to write it.
Sure. Well, the basic idea of the book is that the internet is changing storytelling in ways that I think we don't fully understand yet, and the result of that being that we're in a period of incredible innovation and experimentation, things that all three of these people have been very intimately involved in. As I started working on the book, I began to realize that every technology, whether it's print or movies or television and now the internet, seems to have a form of storytelling, a grammar of storytelling that's native to it. And typically, at least in the 20th century and thereabouts, it's taken people 25 or 30 years to figure out what that was. Nothing instant about it. And we're now a little more than 20 years into the World Wide Web, and I feel like we're only sort of beginning to figure this out. But Susan in particular was one of the people who inspired me to do this. I did a piece for Wired on 42 Entertainment and the Year Zero experience that they designed with Trent Reznor for 9 Inch Nails. And after I did that, I sort of put it together with a couple of other pieces I had done, and I realized that an entirely new form of storytelling was emerging, participatory, nonlinear, and more immersive than ever before, and something that really could not have been done without the web.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about what's available today is that not only can we live in stories and bring stories to life and across, outside of maybe the screens that they were originally created for, but we can also share them. And I think that the idea that we could collectively be in worlds, immerse ourselves in worlds and stories that we love, and kind of share those through the digital technologies that are all connecting us, that's really exciting. And it's also exciting that when I have to leave the house and I have to leave some of my digital devices, I carry digital devices with me and I can continue in experiences. I don't have to just participate in them in one place. And I think that that's opened up a lot of great opportunities for storytellers.
So do you
Yeah,
feel that? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just going to echo what Susan said, and I think there's two really important points that she made there, which are equally as important in the kind of way that we tell immersive stories now. One is that idea of community, and for me, this feels like a return to what storytelling was like before broadcast took over in the beginning of the 20th century. It's really more that we've been in a blip over the last 50 or 60 years where the idea of telling a story to an audience and seeing and hearing and feeling the response from the audience, we've moved away from that being an integral part of how we tell stories, and we're moving back into that space now. We're back into the crowd. And the second point that she made at the end there, which is really important, is context. And I know this is something that Ian's been working on at the BBC, but the idea that now we tell stories for very, very specific places and times, and we think about how stories, relationships to audiences shift when we move from context to context. And again, that's because the contexts of stories have never been as stable as they have been in the kind of golden years of broadcast. The kind of aesthetics and ergonomics of telling stories on TV pretty much didn't change from, say, the 60s through to the first 5 or 6 years of this century. And that's an unnatural and kind of unique period of stability. And normally storytelling has morphed and changed a lot more frequently than that. So the problem is, in a way, we have a generation of storytellers who have lived in the boom years of film, TV, cinema, who expect stories to be told in a certain way. And that has very much been the blip.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great ironies that we call this traditional media, because in fact there's nothing traditional about it at all. It is, as Matt says, it's completely a blip in the larger span of history, and I think definitely we're moving back to something to sort of an earlier experience, but reinventing it at the same time.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same?
In this case, at least, yeah.
I think it's interesting because a lot of people have lost the skills that you need to tell stories in a responsive, iterative way. I think it's no accident that some of the people doing really well on Twitter are people like comedians and musicians who have somewhere in their recent history the experience of a crowd, the experience of actually dealing with hecklers, of actually dealing with call and response, understanding how the flow of a story has to change based on your audience's response to it. And I think if you've worked in a more one-way medium, like, say, publishing or film or TV, you've not been your storytelling skills haven't been honed in front of a crowd as much as if you were a comedian or a musician. So it's interesting that the talent that has those skills are adapting well to this newer era.
And I think that feedback loop is what can really take you to the next level. I think that the idea that, well, for one, people are talking today about how do we connect, how can we connect, and stories are really one of the greatest tools ever, but of all time, and still continue to be, even in this digital age, the way that we connect with each other, whether they're personal or shared or being brought to us by. But I also think that it's really super important that people feel like they can have an influence. I mean, that's what's interesting about some of the tools that are available today. Not to in any way say that we need to give up on the tenets of good storytelling, but the idea that you could influence the story or participate, and that someone is listening to you and reacting to you. Those are some of the best experiences that we've had, where the audience really felt like they had some part in where the story of the world actually went.
No, I think that's absolutely true. There's I recently stumbled across some references to an online lecture, which at the moment does not seem to be available. But it was called When is a Book Not a Book? And it was by a leading Dickens scholar, and it was about Oliver Twist as a serial experience. Dickens published almost all of his novels in monthly installments, a couple of them in weekly installments, and that gave his readers an opportunity to have an influence on where the story went in ways that are fairly rare today. And if anybody knows where I can find this lecture, please let me know. But name, the title, I think, really captures it all. When is a book not a book? When it's, you know, when it's a serial, when it's participatory.
A lot of people from the publishing industry look at the change now and say that this is kind of the end of good storytelling, right? They fear for losing control of their story, of their narrative. And when they look at the examples where the crowd has contributed to the flow of that story, they argue that that's not as good a story, that somehow the quality has been degraded. What do you guys think of that? Is a story that's been made with the help of the crowd still as strong a storytelling experience?
I think, I mean, for me, that's rubbish. I mean, you know, as we said before, we used to tell stories, you know. I'm thinking about the kind of example of sitting around a campfire and telling the story. The crowd was an integral part of the story, but in the way that the storyteller made it, it wasn't just kind of like, I can imagine, you know, some examples of like putting people's names in and stuff like that. That may be a bit too crass. There's ways of, you know, some of the stuff that the audience's background, the audience's experience, you know, kind of informs what the storyteller then says or what the storyteller then talks about, you know, and that's, I think, really, really important. And as Matt Locke said, you know, this is how we used to tell stories. This blip that we've just kind of been through, you know, it just seems like, I mean, for a lot of people I know, they say, well, this is the way it's always been. No, it hasn't. You know, I'd say probably a maximum of 500 years, you know, and it's time to move on.
Well, and I also think that people sometimes confuse, you know, giving people a role in the story with actually giving over control of storytelling.
Yeah.
And I think that there's so many opportunities to give people a chance to be in the world. I mean, how many times have you left a movie and daydreamed and put yourself, maybe this is just me, but, you know, put yourself in the world. And now there's all these technologies. The experience doesn't have to end at the end of the movie. When you walk out of the theater, you can continue in the world in so many interesting and meaningful ways. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that you're giving over control of the story to the audience. But the word I think I used was influence. And I think
Yes.
that, and also feedback, letting them know that you are listening to them and doing things that are things that they're interested in. I think that creates a deeper connection with worlds and experiences. And I mean, you can see it. I mean, I don't know if you guys watch The Walking Dead or play the Walking Dead game or watch Talking Dead. I may or may not do all of those, but you know, I mean, that's an example of like there's all these ways that you can get involved in a world without actually taking over the story.
I think a word you used earlier on, Susan. I think you used the phrase "call and response," which is one I use a lot because it has a long tradition and history as a storytelling technique in theatre and live music performance, in comedy, and it does describe a kind of the role of the storyteller as a kind of choreographer, rather than, you know, somebody that is necessarily just ceding control. And I think call and response is a really important phrase because it describes a relationship between the storyteller and the audience. It's not a buzzword. It's a word that has a long history and really digging into and kind of relearning, because it describes a process of telling and listening and telling and listening. And it is that kind of dual process of being able to tell stories, to quickly process feedback, and then to tell stories in the ways that still take the user on the audience on a really interesting journey. That's at the heart of immersive storytelling. The idea that an immersive story is one where you just create a landscape and just let players or audiences navigate without any kind of direction or choreography is you know, the wrong impression. It is this process of call and response, and that's very much what Dickens was doing when he was publishing weekly and monthly in his era.
Okay, so you guys are saying that, in fact, all of this new amazing technology that's creating immersive storytelling is taking us back to something that's a more true or older form of storytelling. But I'd like to ask, how is this changing? What's new about storytelling now? What kind of different stories are enabled because of the technology?
Well, I think certainly the kind of stories that Susan does, for example. Obviously the web brings people together in ways that were never possible before. I mean, this hangout being a pretty good example. It also invites forms of collaboration that weren't really possible before. So what you have is, I think, a technology that is trending toward, that's taking us back toward earlier forms of engagement and earlier forms of storytelling, but certainly not replicating them. It's leading us to reinvent them, I think, in ways that are appropriate for today and for today's technologies, but because we're right in the middle of that at this point, it's not exactly apparent how that's going to work and how that's going to work in an optimum fashion.
I'd like to say, I think there's two important concepts that digital networks bring to the idea of call and response, immersive or participatory storytelling. One is asynchronicity, and the other one is transgression. So previously, if you were telling a story in a live audience and you had that sense of call and response, you were doing it in a synchronous time frame. All of the audience were part of the story at the same time. And so you could choreograph the group experience in a way that was consistent for all of the audience and was very much built by that sense of scale. You were around the campfire, to use Ian's phrase, or in the theatre, experiencing the story at the same time. What digital networks bring is the possibility of asynchronicity, of being able to engage with a story in your own time scale. And I know this is something that Susan's dealt a lot with at 42. And that brings really interesting issues. How do you build a sense of community when a community the audience might be engaging with the story in different time scales? How do you deal with things like spoilers? How can you choreograph lots of potential routes through the same story space when you're not, as a kind of choreographer, able to deal with the whole audience as a synchronous group? So asynchronicity is a challenge that we're really struggling to deal with and learning to deal with a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. The second one is linked to that, which is the idea of transgression. We've moved from an era of distribution in which the time and the context of storytelling was defined by the methods of transmission, TV or cinema or whatever, very much define the context, to this idea of circulation, where stories achieve scale through sharing, through people taking bits of stories and sharing them in their own contexts. And circulation relies on transgression. It relies, if your story is going to be big in a digital network, it has to be shared. And if it has to be shared, it's going to be shared outside of your control. This is what Henry Jenkins writes about brilliantly in his book Spreadable Media. But that raises really huge issues for storytellers. If people are going to take over parts of your story and spread them in contexts over which you have no control, how do you run that kind of call and response framework? How can you respond quickly to potentially things happening in the story world, either in contexts or in time frames that you never envisaged when you designed the story? So I think those two ideas, asynchronicity and transgression, are the kind of new aspects that digital networks bring to these kinds of very old ideas of immersive storytelling.
The one thing that I would add to what Matt just said is that I think it's also really great as storytellers that you have so many options. And when you come up with a world and a story, you can really think your way through how does that want to be manifested to the world. And there's so many different options. I mean, we just saw it this past weekend where Netflix released a series, and they released all 15 episodes at once. And that's the way that creator wanted that story to get out there, and it's being consumed by people at different levels. I think also there's just a completely different, it's only just started, but a completely different set of tools for storytellers. There's an interesting app out right now that's called Silent History, where these very, very good writers are serializing a story every day, and it's really just allowing the story to unfold over an extended period of time. And that's just really cool. Just the idea that we've all seen movies where the story is just, build character, you build what's going on, there's speculation, there's all this time to really let the story and the world unfold. And I think that there's a lot more platforms and ability to get your story out that doesn't have to be, a weekend movie.
I would say that just on the kind of the new front. So we created this prototype, which is a radio, and the nice thing about it, actually, it's connected to the web, but it also has a proximity sensor, a light sensor, and a microphone. So you can imagine the kind of stories that you could tell to an audience, where if the audience suddenly starts shouting at the radio, it reacts in some way, but reacts within the story rather than pausing or doing whatever you could imagine, simple actions that it could do. And I think that there's a whole ton of opportunities for new types of devices which actually allow the storyteller to really tell the story and get that kind of, I think Matt was talking about the call and response back through the system. And right now we haven't seen much of that, which is a real shame.
What I love about that idea is it kind of gives you a technological extension, to kind of use McLuhan's term, that makes it feel like you're back in a live space. I gave a talk about kind of immersive storytelling to a group of artists a few years ago, and I was talking about call and response and about the kind of need to understand the audience in a very visceral way. I think storytellers fundamentally understand audiences in a really visceral way. There is a kind of tension or a kind of excitement when you see an audience responding, even if that is looking at kind of dots appearing on a Google Analytics graph. And after the talk, somebody came up to me who was a dancer and said that, for her, she gauged the impression she'd made on the audience during her dance performance by the gap between the performance finishing and the beginning of the applause. If it was too soon, so she finished and everybody started applauding immediately, she felt that they hadn't really made any impact, that people were probably, looking at their watches, waiting to leave. If there was a pause, if there was a kind of pregnant silence between the performance finishing and the applause starting, then the longer that pause, the better the effect was. So I love the idea, Ian, that your radio is kind of creating, sound and proximity sensors for storytellers to try and engage with people using that very visceral sense of call and response, even if they are, connected over a digital network.
Yeah.
No, I think it's I think it's brilliant. How did you get started on this, Ian? What was the?
Oh, so actually, there's a long story behind it, but I kind of watch what the edges are doing with technology, and I spotted something which was quite interesting, and kind of just started thinking about how it would work for a mass audience. But the crux of it was implicit actions, because right now, the TV world and the broadcast world is very much about the explicit. So people typing stuff into Twitter, people just typing stuff into Facebook. We wanted to get away from that. We always have this argument. Actually, the head of R&D, we used to have this argument back and forth about. He just said, look, people just want to sit down, sit in the chair, and be entertained. Mm-hmm. Well, they can be, but they can still take part in some way. And this allows them, with the implicit actions, it allows them to still be involved. If they know or they don't know, it doesn't matter. And just kind of inform the story. Now, obviously, we're looking at it for just purely the story point of view, but there's other opportunities that I can imagine other companies will be interested in. We're just scratching the surface, really scratching the surface. There's so much that can be done, and this is why we want to open source this, and we want to allow people to play with it and just kind of build their own and improve on it, because we are just scratching the surface.
I love the idea of the radio being this object that kind of brings the environment, the context that you're listening to the story into the story. It reminds me of I think it's called Sneak. There's a lovely iPad game called Sneak, which uses a microphone on the iPad, and it's a kid's game. And the idea is that there are monsters asleep in your iPad, and so you place the iPad in the middle of the lounge, and you have to quietly try and sneak up and touch the iPad without making enough noise. And the app listens to the microphone, and if there's too much noise in the room, it wakes monsters up. And I love these really, these are really simple technologies which are kind of creating, they turn the room into the story world, and the piece of glass, the kind of glass black mirror that traditionally has been the window into another world, kind of turns the other way then, and it becomes the kind of object that opens the rest of your room into being part of the story world. And I think that's fascinating and something that we're only really just beginning to scratch the surface of.
I agree. I think that's going to be something that you're going to see in the next few years. Is, people trying again to go back to Disney, but to get that sense of immersive storytelling that you would get in a theme park environment. But how could you get that from wherever you are? Yeah. The other thing I would say that I really love about the radio feedback is that we all think we know what's cool. But we love to be validated by other people thinking it's cool too. So that feedback loop, it could be very, very, very important.
Ian, is this radio out and in the world now?
No, this is the only one, unfortunately. We are going to put the plans and details on the web, so it'll be on GitHub. So literally, I can imagine, some kids taking it and just kind of creating, I don't know, you can create a TV out of it and start adding sensors to a TV and manipulating TV in real time. I mean, this can go anywhere. We did talk to, last year we spoke at the Frankfurt Book Fair about, imagine if you had an e-book or e-Kindle or something like that, where every time you pick it up, the words change slightly, only slightly. So if you put it down for 20 days, then maybe it gives you a summary and gives you an idea of what you've missed, because lots of people read stuff in parallel. And it's just real simple examples like that we can just think of, and we just don't have the time and effort to explore all these opportunities. We want the world to do this.
I understand that you're not the only one working in that kind of responsive technology to story worlds. I mean, certainly what's going on in the Connect space and being able to put responsiveness into gaming. And of course, the next step is for it to be able to literally read your emotions, right? To be able to see your facial expressions, hear intonation in your voice, and have the stories evolve or respond in real time to how you're reacting to it. Just like, as we said, the actor or the dancer does while they're on stage with the audience that's there in front of them.
When I was at the BBC many years ago, when I first joined there, we did another radio project actually called, I think it's called The Dark House, which was a kind of an interactive radio horror. And when we were kicking around ideas for measuring fear, we had the idea that actually during the story, the journalist who was at the center of the story would give you her mobile number, and we were going to set it up and not have anything on it, just dead air. And we were going to use the metric of how long people would hang on a line going, hello, 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 as a metric for fear. The longer people were hanging on, then the kind of more the fear was.
That's awesome.
But this is the thing. It's those little things like that which we can do, and that's the power. We can actually take advantage of this stuff. And to the person at the other end, the audience, they're thinking, this is nothing to do with this narrative, but actually it's all part of the greater narrative. This is why I love the stuff that 42 and Saber are doing. They're bringing all these objects and into the world. The whole world is the narrative, which is great.
So as a topic here for us to finish on, when you have these immersive worlds that continue and evolve and grow over time, how do you create a satisfying ending to those stories?
That's a great question. And I think it's a very important question because as people interact more and invest more of their time in these experiences, they definitely want to feel like that there's a payoff, that there's a reward, that they definitely reach the end. And I think that, I'm sure Matt has a lot to say on this subject, but I think one of the things that I'm excited about in the future is just the notion that interactive experiences don't all have to play out at the same time, but that that there's a way for them to live on and be played at, as we program our lives, just like television.
Yeah, I think ending is something I'm fascinated by. We're actually starting a quarterly event tomorrow at Storythings called The Beginning, the Middle, and the End, in which we'll have free speakers, somebody sharing their experience of starting a project, somebody in the middle of a project, and somebody talking about ending it. And that was partly because I don't think we share design patterns for endings very well about digital storytelling projects. I mean, there's a couple that I'm aware of. There's the kind of theatrical event, which was used a lot in early transmedia projects, where all the different threads of the story reconcile into something that is synchronous and is shared by an audience, because that kind of gives the storyteller the opportunity to choreograph something which feels kind of like a proper resolution to the story. Another one which is really emerging a bit is the report, which is a kind of storytelling device which partly comes from games, but partly comes from some other genres as well, which is where you use a kind of feedback structure, a report structure, to give the audience the impression or the kind of resolution of the story. This is something that the theatre group Coney in the UK do really, really well. They've had a couple of plays recently which are participatory plays with the audience. They're developing another one, a new one at the moment, called Imagine You Are Living in the Early Days of a Better Country, where the structure of the theatre play is really about the creation of a new democracy. And they have a particular character, a couple of characters in this version, whose role is the media, and their job is to report on and play back to the audience what the decisions they're making and the impact of the decisions. So they're literally like the kind of storytellers during the immersive performance. And then at the end, there is a moment where the media kind of play back the story to them that kind of ties everything up and creates resolution. So I think the theatrical live event and the report are two structures which we've used at endings, but I think there are dozens, if not hundreds, out there that we're still trying to experiment with and discover.
I think one thing that I just wanted to add on to what you just said, Matt, is that it's available because of our connected technologies and because of our shared social networks, is the idea of using a collaborative goal as a way to draw, especially an interactive storytelling experience to an end, is when you have people collaborate together. So there's personal achievement, but there's also a feeling of community achievement that lets people know, oh wow, we're at the end of this episode, or we're at the end of this chapter.
And I'd like to point out too that it doesn't necessarily depend on technology. I mean, the phenomenon of immersive theater that has grown up in the last few years through this thing that you mentioned, Matt, through things like Secret Cinema in London or Sleep No More in New York. These are immersive and participatory experiences that don't rely on technology at all, but somehow the idea of them seems to be inspired by the kind of interactions that we have on the web. And I think that what we're seeing is in a way using technology to get away from technology, to go back to the possibilities that existed before mass media.
So I see that we had a question from somebody online who's been watching us, and Ian, that's a question for you. Could you give us some examples of the type of response that people could have to the radio? Okay,
so I mean, this is off the top of my head, but there's always a million different responses. But I'm imagining if it was a little bit smaller, maybe you're kind of taking the radio to bed, and we've all done it before. Put radio to bed, and you're kind of hidden if you're under the bed covers, with the radio on, and the radio's playing, and because it knows it's dark, because it recognizes that it's in quite a tight space, it could start to be more dramatic, give you more of a kind of like that kind of pacing rather than the kind of straight pacing that it usually does. And that's a real simple example, very subtle, but you can imagine if you are 9 years old and you're listening to a ghost story and the pacing starts to go and it's like this, you'd be scared witless, you know. And it's kind of like, I mean, the thing about it is, this is just another. It's almost like another tool that a story writer could just use if needs be. And as Matt has already said and Susan said, this is what we would do normally if we were sitting around a campfire, and you get to the bit where it does get kind of quite scary. Everyone's a little bit chilly. You would kind of make your pauses a lot longer and kind of drag things out a little bit. This is what we naturally do.
It's a great example.
Thank you.
Well, it's hard for me to want to end this. Honestly, this is one of these kinds of gatherings where I could spend all day sitting here having a conversation with you guys. So I want to thank everyone for participating today. It was a really wonderful conversation, one of many more to come. I hope you'll come back and join us for future roundtable conversations, as well as come join us for the Future of Storytelling Summit, October 3rd, this fall. And again, thank you, and it's a real honor to get to hang out with you guys. So, story on.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, all.
Okay.